Who would have thought that the most harmless vacation with friends could turn into a real test of survival? That's exactly what happened to Will Slattery, who was just enjoying his vacation, when suddenly the elements took him and his entire crew by surprise. The man not only witnessed the terrible plane crash, but also participated in it. However, it didn't end there. The hero of today's story had to survive the entire day in the open ocean, the waters of which are teeming with sharks. Will Slattery, 34, had been into skydiving since the summer and for about 10 years. It was through this hobby that he met two of his close friends. They often spent time together at Lake El Señor, where they practiced air diving at Sky Diving El Señor. In the spring of 2018, a company of extremists, a lucrative offer came up. Jimmy was able to get cheap airfare to Costa Rica for only $200. They couldn't pass up their chance to bounce around in such a picturesque place, so they quickly decided on a short trip. The trip was to be a memorable adventure for them all. It was supposed to be a short, fun vacation, Will says. We found plane tickets for $200. How could we pass? So a group of close friends, eager to conquer the skies, stopped at the beach resort of Coastal City, 80 miles south of the capital, San Jose. On the third day of the trip, they were already in full swing preparing to skydive. The beautiful clean air and clear skies were just right. Everything was going great, and no one could have imagined that events would take such a tragic turn. On May 30, 2018, the three men were having breakfast together at the resort. The friends were excitedly talking about the upcoming flight into the sky and couldn't even imagine any difficulties. The protagonist was slightly concerned that clouds were gathering in the sky, but he didn't give it much thought. It was their fourth ascent of the day, and they were in for a real treat. The flight was scheduled for this afternoon and was on schedule. For their air diving, the men used the services of Canadian resort owner Milt Burton, who provided them with a plane. Also on board were two Costa Ricans, a student skydiver, and of course, the pilot of the aircraft himself. In all, along with Will himself, there were 6 people on board. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when the plane began to shake violently. Apparently, the crew had hit turbulence, and the uncontrolled turbulent currents had simply knocked the plane right over the waters of the Pacific. Will Slattery vividly remembers all the events of the day he and his friends boarded the plane. The plane took off, and in the middle of the route, the worst thing began. The aircraft began to flutter from side to side. The men panicked and a friend yelled, "Open the door." Will tried to swing the flap open, but nothing worked. It took him 4 tries to finally open the door. The team didn't know how high they were now, or if they had time for the parachute to open as it should, but they were still desperate to escape. The men just jumped into the void. Slattery remembers his comrades disappearing one by one into the darkness. He was alone for a while and tried to pull himself together. He kept telling himself that he trusted the equipment and believed in his jump. When he ventured out, he felt his parachute automatically unhook after 5 to 8 seconds. That meant one thing: they were too low to the ground and flying at an enormous speed of about 700 feet. It was a real shock to me at that moment, Will recalls. And the only thing he was thinking about now was his comrades. The man was peering into the darkness, hoping to see them, when suddenly he noticed Jimmy flying next to him a little farther away and Manny. At first he felt relieved for his friends, for they were still alive and near. Then he tried to call out to them and get their attention to coordinate a joint landing, but the boys didn't respond. And as he took a closer look, he realized what had happened to them horribly. They were flaccid and dangling, and like ragdolls on their parachutes. Their heads were down, and none of them responded. But he hoped that from the sudden jolt of the jump, they had merely passed out. But more nasty thoughts flashed through his mind that they might already be dead. In his panic, the man did not know how to help them, for he himself was in danger of death. He could not move toward them. The wind seemed to be pushing them away from each other until about 40 feet to the surface of the water, when suddenly he heard a loud splash. It was an airplane crashing into the water and beginning to disappear into the churning waves. It was drawn into the dark abyss, and only for a few moments. It appeared out of the abyss, but immediately disappeared from view under a huge ocean wave. Will was in a state of shock and could not come to his senses. Luckily, he had the strength to take action. The plane had sunk, and he was still there, strapped into his parachute equipment. The man had to act very quickly, as he only had 2 to 3 minutes to free himself from the harness. After all, if you find yourself in a situation like this and you land on the water while jumping, the first thing to do is to allow yourself freedom of movement and start to swim. That's hard to do very quickly. But if it's the only chance to survive, you have to act immediately. Slattery plunged into the water and desperately tried to get rid of the parachute. It took him almost 3 minutes. It was a pretty scary feeling, actually, to be able to get caught up in all those straps and drown, he recalls. Once he was free of all the gear, the first thing he wanted to do was find his friends. He hoped they had landed somewhere close to him and he could swim to them and help. After all, if they were unconscious, they would drown quickly, and he could hold their heads above water and bring them to their senses. But he had no idea where he was going. He took off his shoes and shirt to make it easier to paddle in those crazy waves and started calling for his comrades, but no one answered. Will simply swam to where he thought they might be. But all his search turned out to be in vain. He was exhausted and could not find any of the crew. The man found himself all alone in complete isolation in the middle of the open ocean. Saw nothing. Only him and the endless water surface. Total hopelessness and despair tormented him. There seemed to be no more way out. He just floated on his back. His teeth were chattering with cold and his leg was in terrible pain. He had been bitten by a jellyfish, and the waters he was now in were swarming with sharks. He knew that though the plane crash had already happened, the danger was not yet over. Now, without strength or any aids, he could become fish food. But just when the man thought that would be the end of it, he came upon a round floating tree trunk, about 7 feet long and 2 feet in diameter, that floated right under his nose. He couldn't even imagine what this log was doing in the middle of the ocean, but still he decided not to despair and keep fighting for his life. He understood that the main thing in this situation was not to give up and not to panic. "I knew panic would kill me," the man recalls. Of course, it was extremely difficult to remain calm. But the parachute survivor kept repeating to himself that he would be able to overcome all difficulties and would do his best. 5 hours later, the man felt completely exhausted. His muscles were aching, and his adrenaline reserves were exhausted. He was without strength and could see nothing around him. Only darkness surrounded him. He began to rave. He thought he was in some kind of complete isolation, where no one could find him. Suddenly, through the veil, he began to see lights. This revived him, and the man began to bring himself to his senses. On May 31 at about 5:00 p.m., the parachutist was found by local fishermen on their boats. Now, after 24 hours in the open ocean, he was rescued. When the plane went down, friends of the extremists hired a search crew for about $10,000 to locate them. But unfortunately, only the hero of my video survived. The bodies of the others were found on June 3. According to preliminary reports, they died of their injuries, but the only survivor from the plane, Will Slattery, spent about 5 days in the hospital as he suffered severe burns, chest injuries, and dehydration. But despite what happened, he still hasn't lost his love for skydiving. "I still want to do air diving," Slattery said. "It was a plane crash, and jumping saved my life. It's such an amazing rescue story." And that's all, my friends, for today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. Take care of yourself, and see you soon.